between 5000 and 3000 BCE, Europe broke, literally. In 2015, genetic studies published in Science and Genome Research show that up to 90% of male bloodlines vanished in this period. Whole villages collapsed, their houses left to rot. Then the question started to be raised. What could obliterate the male lineage of Europe this way? Or, more likely, who? Turns out, in the same centuries, biologists found plague in the teeth of Neolithic children. But that doesn't explain the gender bias. And then a new presence appears in the record. Kurgan burials rise across Europe, filled with wagons, weapons, and sacrificed animals. In 2015 again, another nature study showed who they belonged to, the yamnaya. They carried the ancestral tongue of nearly every European language. They imposed patriarchal clans and warrior elites where egalitarian societies were the norm. They left behind genes that would both shield against infection and raise the risk of disease. Finally, they left a cultural impact that echoed all the way to the darkest hours of the 20th century Europe. This wasn't migration, it was a collision, plague, replacement and survival. The yamnaya didn't just enter Europe, they rewrote it. To understand who the yamnaya were, we need to step onto their stage. Enter the Pontic-Caspian stage, steppes stretching from the Black Sea to the Caspian, a horizon flat and endless. No forests, no cities, no walls, just grass, wind and space. That's what the yamnayas called home. They were pastoralists, living from their herds of cattle and sheep, unlike Neolithic farmers from Europe already living from agriculture at the time. They were nomadic people, and for the first time in history, people could carry not just themselves, but their entire households across continents. And it showed in how they buried their dead. Kurgans were filled with weapons, card elements, and animal sacrifices, each visible from miles away in this barren landscape. A clan leader lived here. A clan leader will be remembered here. Archaeologists have found thousands of these throughout Europe and Asia, but for more than a century, their story remained strangely silent. The first yamnaya graves described in 1901 by Vasily Gorodtsov, a Russian archaeologist digging in what is now Ukraine, he noticed their distinctive features, the ochre, the wagons, the mounds, and realized he was seeing something different from the farming villages to the west. But in the early 20th century, there was little to connect them to anything larger. They were just more prehistoric people among dozens. And that was the problem. Unlike the Egyptians or the Sumerians, the yamnaya left no writing. Unlike the builders of Stonehenge or Göbekli Tepe, they left no monuments that astonished later generations. As their lifestyle suggested, all they left were mounds of earth, bones stained with red and broken pottery. Still, until the early 2000s, they were mostly a mystery. Their kurgans dotted the map, but their significance was debated endlessly. Were they the Proto-Indian Europeans, the ancestors of Europe's languages, or just one more vanished culture, swallowed by time? Well, for most of the 20th century, they were the latter. Little more than a theory. Nothing could prove they mattered beyond their own horizon. The idea that they might have reshaped Europe or anywhere else was considered fringe, even dangerous. That's what changed in 2015, when Wolfgang Haag and colleagues published in Nature their results comparing the genomes of Neolithic farmers, Bronze Age herders, and modern Europeans. The results detonated like a bomb in archaeology. Across huge swaths of Europe, the genetic signature of early farmers was just gone, replaced almost overnight, at least in evolutionary terms, by the DNA of the yamnaya. In places like Britain and Iberia, up to 90% of the population was replaced within just a few thousand years. For decades, archaeologists had repeated the mantra, pots, not people. Cultures spread, but people themselves mostly stayed put. Migration was an outdated idea in this already populated world. Too simple and too tainted also by its misuse in nationalist ideologies. But ancient DNA told a different story. It showed that whole Aboriginal populations could and did vanish. The Yamnaya didn't just appear in Europe, they repopulated it. And they didn't stop there. Their DNA spread east as well, into Central Asia and eventually South Asia. A 2018 study in Science traced their genetic influence into the Swat Valley of northern Pakistan, linking them to the ancestors of Indo-Aryan speaking peoples. From Ireland to India, their genetic fingerprints turned up again and again. And then the study's data revealed the most unsettling part. The replacement wasn't sex-biased. Studies showed that Yamnaya men intermarried or perhaps imposed themselves on local farming women. The Y chromosome lineages passed from father to son were overwhelmingly Yamnaya. By contrast, their mitochondrial DNA passed from mothers showed far more continuity with Europe's earlier farmers. In plain terms, steppe men, local women. The male side of Neolithic Europe was wiped out. The female side lived on, absorbed into the clans of the newcomers. That asymmetry left behind lasting marks. Today, the most common paternal haplogroups in Europe, R1b in the west, R1a in the east, both trace back to Yamnaya ancestry. They are literally the fathers of Europe. The genetics also revealed the Yamnaya's own origins. They were a fusion, a mix of Eastern European hunter-gatherers and Caucasus hunter-gatherers. Somewhere on the open grasslands north of the Black Sea, these two populations met and merged, creating a new genetic profile that would sweep continents. Cultures like corded ware in northern Europe and bell beaker in the west, once thought to be mostly local developments, turned out to be filled with steppe ancestry. The old mantra model collapsed, the people mattered, and their real name was Yamnaya. What made them so successful? Was it the horse, the wagon, the plague that cleared their path, or the ruthlessness of their patrilineal clans? The answer is still debated, but one thing was clear. Without them, modern Europe would look, sound, and even be very different. They weren't just another prehistoric culture. They were the reset button on Europe's population, and their influence didn't stop with genes. They carried a language that would one day fragment into hundreds. For centuries, linguists puzzled over why so many languages across Europe and Asia seemed related. From English to Greek, Sanskrit to Russian, Persian to Irish. They all share deep structural similarities and ancient roots. Surprising for such a large area and so different cultures. By the 18th century, scholars like Sir William Jones noticed that Sanskrit, Latin and Greek were too close to be coincidence. They must have come from a common ancestor. That ancestor is what we now call Proto-Indo-European, the mother tongue of nearly half the world's population today. Reconstructed vocabulary gives us a glimpse into their world. Wheel, axle, horse and cow, wagon and yoke. They're the words of a nomadic people, similar to the Inuit who have 16 different words for snow. But they also had other, more tainted words: kinship, hierarchy, king, chieftain, guest, and oath, all trace back to Proto-Indo-European roots. All these suggest a world where loyalty, obligation, and reputation mattered as much as food and shelter. A guest wasn't just a visitor. The word carries undertones of sacred duty and protection. And then there's religion. Many Indo-European cultures worshipped a sky father, Zeus in Greece, Jupiter in Rome, Deus Pitta in the Vedas. All of them echo a Proto-Indo-European figure. Deus Vater, literally sky father. It was a concept carried across thousands of miles, reshaped but never erased. Other myths travel too. The divine twins, sons of the sky god, appear as Castor and Pollux in Greece, the Ashvins in India, and the Dioscuri in Rome. The ritual sacrifice of cattle, central in Vedic hymns, has parallels in Homeric Greece. Even taboo words reveal connections. In several branches of Indo-European, the word for bear was avoided and replaced with euphemisms, an echo of a shared mythic fear. This doesn't mean every Indo-European culture was the same though, as they spread their language fractured into dialects, then full-fledged tongues, shaped by local environments and encounters with older populations. Today, more than 3 billion people speak Indo-European languages: English, Hindi, Spanish, Russian, Persian, French, Bengali, German, Portuguese, and so on. No other prehistoric migration has left such a vast linguistic shadow. But language isn't just words. It's worldview. And Proto-Indo-European seems to match what we know of Yamnaya society, a world where hierarchy, inheritance, and warrior elite were naturalized in both grammar and myth. That linguistic and cultural package carried weight. It gave structure to the new societies that emerged after the Yamnaya arrived. Egalitarian farming villages were transformed into stratified communities. Chiefs became kings. Hospitality became law. Oaths became sacred, and while we can never reconstruct their full stories, their words are still on our tongues. The Yamnaya didn't leave epics nor cities, but they left us language, and with it a way of seeing the world that still shapes billions of lives. And that worldview was reinforced not only by words and myths, but by tools of power: the horse, the wagon, and perhaps even the plague. Built for the steppe, the Yamnayas had a secret weapon. Actually, they had several: bodies, lifestyle, and the cultures that bound them together. First, their diets. Most Neolithic Europeans were farmers. They lived in longhouses, tethered to plots of barley and wheat, relying on a poor diet of porridge and bread. The Yamnaya lived differently. Cattle and sheep provided a diet rich in meat and dairy, far higher in protein. Isotopic analysis of their bones shows steady consumption of animal products. Not only was their diet richer, but they also had higher allele frequencies linked to stature, robust bone structure, and lean body mass, which correlates today with better muscle development and athletic performances. They even had both heavier muscle attachments and greater responsiveness to testosterone, and it shows. When archaeologists first measured Yamnaya skeletons, they were noticeably taller than the Neolithic farmers they replaced. Average male height was around 175 to 180 centimeters, which is about 10 centimeters taller. Actually, they were taller than most Europeans until the 20th century. They also carried genetic adaptations shaped by their pastoralist life. Studies in Nature, 2020, Alan Toft et al., shows that Yamnaya genomes carried higher frequencies of alleles linked to lactose persistence. So, not only had they access to more milk, they didn't have to process it to digest it, unlike most populations. Fresh milk was a staple, an extra calorie source that gave them resilience during lean seasons. But Yamnaya's genetic carried burdens as well. Some alleles that helped them fight infections in close-knit herding societies also increased susceptibility to autoimmune disorders. A 2024 Nature study traced risk variants for multiple sclerosis back to steppe populations. In other words, the same immune systems that once gave them survival advantages left an echo of vulnerability in modern Europeans. And they didn't just differ physically. The same 2020 study showed they also carried genes influencing cognition, stress, and neurodiversity. Their DNAs were enriched for variants later associated with abstract reasoning and educational attainment, the kind of profile that may have favored language spread and complex planning. Others tied to the immune system overlap with modern autism spectrum risk, particularly genes like SHANK3 and CNTNAP2 linked to synaptic plasticity. Far from being maladaptive, these traits could have fueled the Yamnaya's pattern recognition, detail orientation, and strict rule following. Meanwhile, still in 2020, Translational Psychiatry study noted that steppe-related populations show enrichment for alleles regulating the HPA axis, the body's stress response system, conferring greater resilience under hardship. Combined with the male-driven social bottlenecks documented in their Y chromosomes, which rewarded dominance and risk-taking, the yamnaya carried a very distinctive psychological toolkit: resilient under stress, systemizing in thought, loyal to hierarchy, and capable of transmitting an enduring linguistic and cultural order. It does sound like super soldier advantages, and as the culture prized risk-taking, hierarchy and loyalty, it would naturally elevate warriors as the embodiment of these traits. The raw material of a martial ethos, one that allowed mobile wardrobes to expand, intimidate, and ultimately dominate the farming societies they encountered. Then there were the horses. Now, horse domestication wasn't invented by them. That happened further east in Botai culture sites of Kazakhstan around 3500 BCE. But they integrated horses into their world in ways no one had before. Evidence from bitware on horse teeth and residues of mare's milk suggests that by the late 4th millennium BCE, they were riding and milking horses. Even if not yet cavalry, horses gave them speed, scouting ability, and herding efficiency. A mounted band could raid a farming community, vanish into the horizon, and return before the enemy regrouped. But there may have been another, darker ally at their side: plague. Throughout Bronze Age Europe, DNA analysis showed Yersinia pestis was wreaking the continent havoc. Less contagious, but very deadly. They spread silently along the trade routes of late Neolithic Europe, preying on dense farming villages. Malnourished children, already stressed by crop failures, died young. Communities collapsed. The yamnaya, living in small, scattered groups, may have been less exposed. Distance itself acted as protection. Where farmers fell, herders rode on. This convergence, biological robustness, dietary resilience, lactose tolerance, wagons, horses, and perhaps plague made for quite the build. Farming villages that had endured for millennia suddenly looked fragile against a people who could outpace, outfight, and outlast them. Still, question remains, especially in their role with the plague. Did they bring it with them, or did they arrive in an already desolated place? Anyhow, their way of being human, bodies and culture evolved for survival on the steppe, unleashed on a continent of farmers that just couldn't rival them. But the yamnaya didn't just turn Europe upside down. Their migrations also spilled east, across the vast grasslands of Central Asia and into the Indian subcontinent, and here their legacy became one of the most bitterly debated topics in history: the question of the Aryans. Language was the first hint. In the 19th century, colonial scholars noticed striking similarities between Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin. To them, the conclusion was obvious. India's earliest sacred language had arrived with outsiders, a people they called the Aryans. This became the Aryan invasion theory. Warriors from the north stormed into India, destroyed the Indus Valley civilization, and imposed their language and religion. For European empires, it was a convenient story. Civilization itself had to come from the outside. By the 20th century, Indian scholars began to push back. They argued that Sanskrit and the Vedas were indigenous, born on Indian soil, not imported from abroad. In nationalist narratives, the Aryan invasion theory became a symbol of colonial arrogance. By the time independence came, the term invasion was almost a curse word. For decades, the question split archaeology down the middle. Were the Aryans outsiders or natives? Did they bring their culture in, or did it grow from the Indus? Ancient DNA has now forced a reckoning. In 2018, a major study published in Science analysed genomes from the Swat Valley in northern Pakistan, dating between 1200 and 800 BCE. They found a significant proportion of ancestry in these populations came from the steppe, closely related to the Yamnaya and their descendants. And once again, this ancestry was especially strong in the male line, carried by the Y chromosome haplogroup R1a, still common today across northern India, Pakistan and Eastern Europe. Other studies, including a 2019 paper in Cell, confirmed that steppe ancestry arrived in South Asia after 2000 BCE. It didn't erase local populations the way it had in Britain or Iberia. Instead, it mixed, forming a genetic gradient still visible today. Stronger steppe influence in the north, weaker in the south. The cultural echoes are just as clear. Sanskrit, the language of the Vedas, is Indo-European. Its structure and vocabulary mirror Greek, Latin and Old Norse. Words like Pitta for father, Mata for father and Deva for god are near identical to their European cousins. The material record also fits. Horses, absent from the Indus Valley civilization, appear with the Indo-Aryans. The chariot, so central to Vedic ritual and warfare, was a steppe innovation, spreading east from Yamnaya descendant cultures. Even rituals like the Ashmedha, the royal horse sacrifice described in Vedic texts, echo earlier Indo-European traditions of equine offering. Taken together, the evidence points not to a single catastrophic invasion, but to waves of migration and mixing. Farmers of the Indus Valley steppe herders and indigenous foragers all contributed to South Asia's genetic and cultural mosaic. The steppe groups didn't replace, but they reshaped. They brought new language, new rituals, and new lineages that merged into a uniquely Indian civilization. And yet, in India today, the origins of the Aryans remain politically sensitive. Nationalists reject the genetic findings, insisting on indigenous origins for Sanskrit and the Vedas. What can't be disputed is the steppe connection itself. Yamnaya, through their descendants, did reach South Asia. They carried with them genes, gods, and words still alive today. Hindi, Bengali, Punjabi, and dozens of other tongues are Indo-European because of migrations that began on the steppe 5,000 years ago. But their legacy reached new and paradoxically darker heights in the modern world, twisted, politicized, and sometimes weaponized by movements that saw in them either noble ancestors or racial destiny. Fast forward to the 19th and 20th centuries. Europe is fueled by the fire of ultranationalism. The continent has always, more or less, been at war for most of its history. But the conflicts it's about to face are on a whole new scale. On the verge of World War I and World War II, back from the dead, Yamnayas were reborn in imagination as the so-called Aryans. Talk about a wild rebranding. The trouble began when linguists first reconstructed the Indo-European language family. But it quickly escaped the academy. Romantic nationalists across Europe seized on the idea of an original Indo-European people. For Germans, they became noble ancestors of the Teutons. For Celts, proof of ancient dignity. For Hindus, a validation of Sanskrit's sacred status. Everyone wanted a piece of the Indo-European story. And to make it more appealing, they gave it a new name, Aryan. In its original Sanskrit usage, Arya simply meant noble or honourable, but in 19th century Europe it was reimagined as a racial category, a bloodline of conquerors. Soon, Aryan became a political weapon. And by the early 20th century, the idea had hardened into ideology. In Germany, writers like Huston, Stewart and Chamberlain claimed that Aryans were the creators of all civilization, and their decline came from racial mixing. A wild idea now that we know they were a mix themselves. These pseudo-scientific ideas would later be absorbed and radicalized by the Nazis. Aryans then became a myth of racial destiny, cast as the master race, destined to rule the others, if not to wipe them out of existence completely to avoid corruption. In this twisted genealogy, the kurgan burials of the Yamnaya became ancestral shrines. Their migrations became a story of racial conquest. Of course, the real Yamnaya left no evidence of racial purity. Quite the opposite. No text glorifying conquest or even evidence they were all tall blonde people with blue eyes. But the damage was done. The Nazi appropriation of Indo-European studies left the entire field radioactive. After 1945, archaeologists recoiled. Migration theories, once central to prehistory, fell out of favour. Scholars began to stress continuity instead. Cultures spread by imitation, not by movement of people, hence the pots, not people mantra. The term Aryan became emotionally charged with all the racial theories from the Nazis. They had made the entire subject dangerous, all researchers preferred to not mention. It took a technological revolution in ancient DNA to reinforce them in the public field. In 2015, when Haak and colleagues demonstrated massive population replacement in Europe, it was a shock to decades of orthodoxy. Migration was back, not as ideology, but as a genetic fact. Still, the misuse hasn't stopped. In India, the Aryan debate remains deeply political. The very idea of an ancestral ghost tribe carries a dangerous allure. This is the paradox of the yamnaya. When you leave nothing behind, there's plenty of room for bullshit. And that's why they were the perfect origin story for Nazi Germany, or all far-right movements of Europe and America, to be fair. The truth is both simpler and stranger. The Yamnayas were a Bronze Age people whose mobility, biology and culture allowed them to spread far beyond their homeland. They mixed, adapted and disappeared. Their genes remade Europe. Their languages became half the world's mother tongues. Their social systems echoed in myths and religion. But still, we had no idea till the DNA studies. They influenced all the way to our societies, and not the distant ones. There's echoes up to today. The warrior class became feudal kings and lords, then nobles, throughout all Europe until the 18th century. When democracy spread, they shifted into upper-class merchants, politicians or other types of first-class citizens, without even breaking the balance of power in their favour. And behind the myths and the intangibles, the bones tell another story. One written by mass graves and violence. Between 5000 and 3000 BCE, Europe broke. Bloodlines ended, villages fell silent, plague tore through the fields. Out of the steppe, like ghosts, came the yamnaya. And nothing was the same again. No grand monuments or epic tales of conquest, but they left marks way more influential than any of that. They spread through 2 continents, over thousands of kilometers, thanks to horses and wagons. Their descendant languages are spoken by billions. Hierarchy, patriarchy, loyalty all became the backbone of the Bronze Age and the scaffolding of the societies that followed. They carried strength, tall bodies, protein-rich diets, lactose tolerance, stress-hardening immune systems. They carried burdens too. Autoimmune disease alleles, psychiatric risks, neurodiverse traits that still shape lives today. And yet, except for their blood, they disappeared like all the others. They're a stark reminder that no matter the level of dominance you have over your environment, nobody ever beats time. Because, as Keynes said, in the long run, we're all dead. But despite that, if you listen closely, very closely, you might just hear the loud, feared cries coming from the steppes. I hope this video helped you to reframe the Yamnayas, restless, ruthless, and carved from the steppes. If their story triggered your curiosity, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Your engagement is what keeps this channel alive. Share it so more people know the ghost tribe that still lives inside us. And tell us in the comments, do you think their rise was worth the cost? Till next time, keep listening to the echoes.